8:55 on a Thursday morning. The front steps of Prescott Tower on Front Street, Wilmington. Elena Cross stepped out of the car. Behind her came two representatives from the state pension fund and a reporter with a camera already raised. She saw the man near the revolving door. Blue flannel. A leather satchel. A long tube on his shoulder, dust still on his boots. She didn't look twice. "The help uses the back door," she said, and pointed toward the corner of the building. He nodded once and walked the way she pointed. She had no idea who he was. By the end of the morning, everyone in that lobby would. Stay with it. The man she just pointed toward the back is about to walk through the front door of his own life, and hers won't look the same after. 2 hours earlier, on the other side of the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge, the kitchen of a small house in Leland smelled like batter and coffee. Dean Sutter stood at the stove in a gray t-shirt, the blue flannel folded over the back of a chair behind him. He flipped a pancake with a wooden spatula. Morning light came through the window over the sink and laid a square of warmth across the table. His daughter Sadie sat there in small wire-rimmed glasses, building a tower out of Lego blocks one piece at a time, slow and careful, her tongue tucked into the corner of her mouth. "Dad." She didn't look up. "How many columns does a building this tall need on the bottom so it doesn't fall down?" Dean glanced at her top tier and counted. "Depends what you put on it, Sadie girl. Count what you've stacked and we'll figure it out." She bent her head and counted under her breath. He slid a pancake onto her plate, set cut strawberries beside it. On the wall above the table hung an old photograph. Dean, younger, hair a little longer. A woman beside him with the same brown eyes Sadie had. A 4-year-old Sadie on her father's hip, laughing with her mouth wide open. Behind them, a tower of glass and steel caught the late afternoon sun. The day Prescott Tower opened, 2015. Josephine had told him to take that project. "You're ready," she'd said. "Stop pretending you're not." 3 years and 7 months without her now. Dean had learned to count mornings the way other men counted money. 12, Sadie said. "I need 12 columns." "Sounds about right." At 7:35 he drove her to Leland Elementary in his old white pickup. The marsh grass along the road was turning gold. Sadie talked the whole way about a class trip the following week. "We're going to a building downtown. The tall one with the fish tank in the lobby." Dean kept his eyes on the road. "That'll be fun." "You know that building, Dad?" A small pause. "I've heard of it." He walked her to the gate, straightened her backpack strap, reminded her to eat her sandwich. She hugged him hard and ran inside. At 8:15 he opened the door of Sutter Drafting and Print. Small shop, clean counter, one big plotter against the back wall, the dry paper smell of fresh blueprints. His one employee was already sealing a delivery tube with tape. "Morning, boss. The Prescott order's done." They called at 7, said it's for the reopening ceremony. "Wants it upstairs by 9 sharp, skip the loading dock, go straight to the 12th floor." Dean went still at the name Prescott. He hadn't set foot in that building since 2019. "I'll take it." "You sure?" "I can run it before class. I've got something out that way anyway." Dean slung the tube over his shoulder, grabbed his satchel, and pointed the truck toward the bridge, the marsh grass giving way to open water as the road climbed toward the span. At the same hour, 28 floors above Front Street, Elena Cross stood at the mirror in her office and checked the line of her jacket for the 3rd time. No jewelry except a thin watch on her wrist. She'd laid the outfit out the night before, the way she'd been doing every night for 5 months. Her assistant knocked once. "Ms. Cross. Mr. Prescott's on 32. Arrived at 7:45. Asked not to be disturbed until 10. She turned from the mirror. "When was his last visit to this tower?" 5 months ago. "The day you started." She didn't need him to say the rest. Walton Prescott didn't come to branch offices for the view. He was watching her. She thought, for half a second, of her final interview 6 months back, a long table, a director leaning forward, asking what she believed the greatest weakness of a young CEO was. She'd answered without hesitating. Perceived authority. People see your age before they see your work. The director hadn't smiled. He'd only written something down. Desmond Cray stood in her doorway now, tablet in hand. 49 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of calm that came from 20 years of never raising his voice. 3 things before the delegation gets here. The pension fund team moved up to 8:55. The reporter confirmed. And there's a rush delivery for the display. I told them to skip the loading dock, go straight to 12. Didn't want it slowing down the front of the house. Elena nodded and let it go. She didn't ask which print shop. She had no reason to. She lifted her coat off the chair and remembered, for no reason, something Cray had told her during her first week. He'd crossed one leg over the other and said, gently, the lobby is the face of this company. A delegation never sees work clothes near the revolving door. I've held that line 8 years. Hold it harder than I do, and the board will trust you. She had taken every piece of advice he'd ever given her, the way a person takes the first map handed to them in an unfamiliar city, without checking it against anything else. At 8:55 she rode the executive elevator down, watching the floor numbers fall. The delegation's cars were already turning the corner at the end of the block. She stepped through the revolving door into the bright October light and lifted her chin to meet them, rehearsing the names in her head one more time, Adele Winters first, then Foster Lang, then the 2 younger staffers whose titles she'd memorized on the drive-in. 32 floors above her, Walton Prescott stood at the window of his private office with a coffee cup in his hand. He watched the delegation step out. He watched Elena walk forward to greet them. Then his eye caught movement across the street. An old white pickup at the curb. A man stepping down in a blue flannel and work boots, sliding a long tube out of the cab and onto his shoulder. Walton set his cup down on the sill, very carefully, and didn't look away. 8:55. The help uses the back door. Dean nodded once and walked the way she'd pointed. He didn't look back at her. He didn't look at the delegation. He walked along the limestone face of the tower with the tube on his shoulder and his free hand in his pocket, and his expression didn't change. He'd designed the service entrance himself. 140 feet from the front door, around the corner, past the planter he'd specified to break the wind off the river. At the east door, Loretta Byrne was on the morning floor with a clipboard. 58 years old, 22 years in this building. She'd been the one who handed Dean his commemorative key at the opening ceremony. She looked up. She saw him. The clipboard tilted in her hand. Mr. Sutter. It's all right, Loretta. He kept his voice low. Good to see you. She logged him in fast, her hands not quite steady, and walked him to the service elevator without another word. She had no authority to undo what the CEO had just done in front of a delegation and a camera. She only wanted him inside, quietly, before anyone else got a good look. On 12 he handed the tube to a young woman in a headset who didn't look at his face. She signed a form, thanked him without really seeing him, and turned back to the display she was building for the ceremony. He took the service elevator back down and started for the loading exit, already thinking about the 3 o'clock pickup and nothing else. He had no idea what he'd just started. 2 floors above him, someone was about to find out the hard way. At 9:24, 3 floors above him, Elena was walking the delegation back to the lobby for photographs. Adele Winters was beside her. Foster Lang a step behind, watching everything. Micah Sorrell had his camera raised. The executive elevator chimed. The doors opened. Walton Prescott stepped out. 74 years old. Gray suit. White hair combed back. The delegation turned as one. Foster's mouth opened slightly. Adele inclined her head a fraction of an inch. Elena went forward at once, professional smile in place. "Mr. Prescott. We're honored to." He lifted one hand. Not unkindly. A small flat gesture that meant wait. He walked past her. He walked past the whole delegation. He crossed the marble floor toward the east corridor, and Dean Sutter came out of it at the same moment with his satchel on his shoulder. Walton stopped in front of him and put out his hand. "Dean. Forgive me for letting you walk into your own building through the back." The lobby went quiet. The fountain ran. Micah's shutter clicked twice. Dean took the older man's hand. He didn't smile. He inclined his head. "Walton." Walton turned, took Dean by the elbow, and walked him toward the delegation, his voice pitched low and clear to carry. "Members of the council. Ladies and gentlemen. May I present Dean Sutter. Lead architect of this building. Recipient of the AIA Regional Award in 2015. The man whose name is on the cornerstone you walked past coming in." Adele Winters was the first to move. She stepped out of line and offered her hand. "Mr. Sutter. It's a very great pleasure." Foster Lang was second, then the two younger staffers behind him, each one shaking Dean's hand a beat slower than the last, as if still recalculating who exactly they were meeting. Micah took 3 photographs in quick succession and lowered the camera with a strange, careful look on his face. Elena stood where she was. The blood had gone out of her cheeks. She could feel the marble cold through the soles of her shoes. At the far end of the lobby, near the security desk, Desmond Cray had stopped walking. He took one half step back into the shadow of a column, then turned and walked briskly toward the stairs instead of the elevator, his tablet still lit under his arm. His face had gone the color of old paper. Nobody in that lobby was watching him. That was the only reason he made it to the stairwell before his hand started to shake. Walton was already inviting the delegation upstairs for coffee. He extended the invitation to Dean with a small nod. Dean shook his head, polite. "I've got to pick up my daughter at 3. You'll come back another day." "I will." Dean walked out through the revolving door. He didn't look at Elena on his way out. She didn't watch him go. She turned, professionally, and gestured the delegation toward the elevators. Adele fell in beside her. In the elevator going up, Adele watched the floor numbers climb. "Ms. Cross. I think you and I should have a private conversation later this week." "Yes," Elena said. "I think we should." She got the delegation to coffee. She sat at the head of the table on 32 and made the introductions she'd rehearsed for 2 weeks. Walton said nothing about the lobby. He poured cream into his cup and asked Foster intelligent questions about pension allocation for the better part of an hour. He didn't look at her once, and somehow that was worse than anything he could have said. At 12:30 she returned to her office, closed the door, and stood at the window a long time. Then she sat down and typed the name Dean Sutter into the corporate archive. 23 results. Sutter Studio Architecture. Founding Principal. Lead Architect on the Prescott Tower Commission, 2012 through 2014. AIA Regional Award, 2015. A photograph of a man in a black jacket at a podium, a younger woman beside him, a small girl in the woman's arms. The obituary came up at the bottom of the page. Josephine N. Sutter. Survived by her husband Dean and her daughter Sadie. March, 2022. The studio closed 3 months later, according to a single line in a local business journal that nobody at Prescott Properties had apparently ever bothered to read. Elena sat very still, the cursor blinking at the end of an empty search bar she didn't have the nerve to fill in twice. At 2 she drove across the bridge to Leland. She found Sutter drafting in print on a quiet street off the main road. The door was locked. A young man inside waved her off through the glass, closed for the afternoon, gone to pick up his daughter. She stood on the sidewalk in the October sun and felt foolish, the way she hadn't let herself feel foolish since her first year out of business school. She took a business card from her wallet, crossed out her title with one clean line of pen, and wrote underneath, in her own hand, "Dean. I owe you an apology that doesn't come through an assistant. Call whenever you're ready. Or don't." She slid it under the door and stood there another moment, listening to nothing, before she walked back to her car. That evening at 6:15, Desmond Cray sat in his car in the parking garage, phone to his ear, talking to a board member named Foster Lange's counterpart in Atlanta, a man he'd known for 11 years. "We need to talk about this morning." She insulted the chairman's personal architect in front of the state pension fund. "There's a photograph in tomorrow's paper. I'm not raising the issue. I'm just saying, the optics." The voice on the other end said something that took a long time to say. Cray listened. He smiled at the steering wheel. "Of course. Just wanted you to have the picture." At the same hour, Dean opened his front door and let Sadie run past him into the kitchen for a snack. He put the mail on the counter without looking at it. "Dad. Did you go in the building with the fish today?" He kept his face still. "I did. For a minute." "What's inside?" He thought of the marble. The fountain. The 74-year-old man with his hand out. "It's a nice building," he said. "I think you'll like it next week." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to arguing with a stubborn Lego block that wouldn't sit flat. Dean stood at the counter a moment longer than he needed to, looking at nothing, before he started on dinner. Saturday morning was bright and cold. Elena had slept badly 2 nights running, thinking about the marble floor and the line on it where her career had quietly opened up beneath her. She hadn't planned on going anywhere. But by Sunday evening she'd read the archive page 4 times and looked at the photograph of the young woman with the small girl until she stopped being able to look at anything else. Monday morning, Walton Prescott called Dean directly and asked him to come in. They met in the conference room on the 32nd floor. Walton didn't waste time. "I'd like you to consult on the Riverwalk project. The old warehouse district, first phase breaking ground next month. It ties into the tower's original foundation work, so I need someone who actually understands what's under this building, not just what's drawn on top of it. There isn't anyone else alive who knows it the way you do." Dean shook his head before Walton had finished. "I don't sign drawings anymore. You know that. I'm not asking for your signature. I'm asking for your eyes. 4 mornings a week. You set the hours." Dean was quiet a long moment. Through the window the Cape Fear River sat the color of pewter under a low sky. 3 o'clock pickup, he said finally. "That isn't negotiable. Written into the agreement. The scope would include a full review of the tower's original structural and contractor records, since the new project would tie directly into the existing foundation. Elena would administer from the Prescott side. Dean would work out of a small office on the 29th floor, starting Tuesday. For a week they worked in the same building and barely spoke. She brought him drawings. He marked them with a soft pencil and handed them back without a word about anything else. She noticed he never took the executive elevator, always the stairs or the service car, and she never asked him why. Thursday evening they worked late. At 9 she had food sent up to the small conference room. The floor had gone quiet 2 hours earlier. Only the hum of a vacuum somewhere down the hall, and the tick of the building settling the way old towers do after the sun goes down. She asked, quietly, about Josephine. He set his fork down. He took a moment. "She was sick for 10 months. I wasn't home as much as I should have been. I was finishing a project up in Raleigh. Told myself I'd wrap it by Christmas and be there for whatever came next. Christmas came. I still wasn't home enough. I'm sorry. It's an old grief. It has its place now." She didn't press. She told him, after a silence, about her mother, a hotel clerk in Savannah, a guest who once handed her a tip and told her to clean the room better next time. She kept it. Said money was money. I was 13. I swore I'd never be the person standing on the other side of that exchange. Elena looked at her hands. And Thursday morning, I was. Dean looked at her a long moment. Sometimes we're so afraid of becoming the thing we hate that we become it anyway. She didn't answer that. She picked up her fork and looked at the table. Down the hallway, Desmond Cray passed the conference room with a folder in his hand. He stopped at the narrow window beside the door, held up his phone, and photographed them through the glass. No flash. No sound. He didn't know it yet, but the folder he was carrying, pulled from an old maintenance archive he thought no one would ever open again, was about to matter a great deal more than the photograph. The following Tuesday, Sadie's class arrived at Prescott Tower for their field trip, exactly as planned 2 weeks before. Elena met them in the lobby herself. Sadie spotted her father first, standing near the fountain in his flannel with a badge clipped to his pocket, and broke from the line to run at him. Then she saw Elena and stopped, curious, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. "You're the lady who left the card," Sadie said, in the small precise way children keep track of grown-up mysteries. Her father had left the card on the counter for 2 days before he'd finally thrown it away, and Sadie had read it twice while he wasn't looking. "I'm Elena," she said, crouching down. "I work here." Sadie considered this with great seriousness, then pointed at one of the cast iron columns running down the lobby. "My dad made these. He made most of this building," Elena said. "I just keep the lights on." Sadie thought about that. That's important too. Dean came up behind his daughter, hands in his jacket pockets, and for a moment the three of them stood together under the skylight while 22nd graders filed past toward the fish tank, a teacher counting heads out loud, a boy pressing his whole face against the glass. That afternoon, back in the small office on 29, Dean worked through the original contractor files for the tower's foundation, cross-referencing them against the new Riverwalk drawings. It was slow work. Invoices, change orders, material certifications going back 14 years, most of it exactly as boring as it sounds, until it wasn't. He found it a little after 4. A structural steel order from 2013, priced nearly 40% above every comparable line item in the file, routed through a supplier called Coastal Fabrication Partners, a name that appeared exactly once in 14 years of records and never again. The approval signature at the bottom was Desmond Cray's, the same neat, confident signature Dean remembered from 100 other change orders he'd signed off on without a second look. Dean sat with it a long moment, running his thumb along the edge of the page the way he used to check a print for a flaw before it went out the door. Then he carried the folder down the hall and set it on Elena's desk without a word. She read it twice. "This was during construction," she said. "Before I ever set foot in this state." "Before you," Dean agreed. "Not before him." She looked up at him. "You think he's still doing it?" "I think a man who lies about 140 feet of hallway doesn't usually stop at one lie." She turned it over once more before closing it. "Does Loretta know you found this?" "Not yet. I wanted you to see it first." Elena closed the folder. Outside her window the river caught the last of the afternoon light, and somewhere below them, on a floor neither of them could see, Desmond Cray was already making a phone call that would try to bury this exact conversation before it had the chance to grow teeth. Friday morning, a formal complaint landed on the desk of every director on the parent board in Atlanta. Desmond Cray had filed it himself, under his own name, framed as a cultural leadership concern. 2 photographs, time-stamped. Elena Cross and Dean Sutter, alone in a small conference room after hours. An attached memo noted that the CEO of Prescott Properties Southeast had publicly humiliated the chairman's personal architect before the state pension fund and now appeared to be conducting a private relationship with the same man, raising questions about her judgment and her neutrality. Nowhere in the complaint was there any mention of Coastal Fabrication Partners. Elena read the memo at 6 in the morning at her kitchen counter with a cup of black coffee. She read it twice, set it down, and read it a third time before she washed the cup and dressed for the kind of day she'd learned to recognize by now: the navy suit, the flat shoes, the watch turned so the face sat square on the inside of her wrist. Dean got a short email from Walton at 8, summoning him to the 32nd floor conference room Thursday at 10. No reason given, no subject line beyond his own name. He read it twice standing at the counter, then drove across the bridge with his hands light on the wheel and the radio off. Down at the reception desk, Loretta Byrne had been quietly keeping her own notes for 2 weeks, not because anyone asked her to, but because 22 years in a building teaches a person to notice when the same man starts appearing near the record archive after the cleaning crew has already gone home. She kept the list folded small in her pocket, updated in pencil. She'd written down 4 dates. Each one lined up, almost to the hour, with a night Cray had told building security he was finishing paperwork. On the third of those nights, she'd walked past the archive room herself on her way to the supply closet and seen the light still on under the door at 11. She hadn't said anything then. Her contract renewal was 3 months out, and Cray was the officer who signed it. She said something now. She called Walton Prescott's office directly Wednesday morning, gave her name to a secretary who didn't recognize it, and asked for 5 minutes before Thursday's hearing. She got 15, in his office, with the door closed. Walton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked out at the river for a long moment. 22 years, he said, and you never once brought me a complaint I didn't need. I'm not looking to make trouble, Mr. Prescott. I'm looking to stop it before it lands on the wrong people. It already has, Walton said. We're just about to find out how far. He asked her one more question before she left the office. Does anyone else know what you found? Only Mr. Sutter. He's the one who pointed me at the right dates. Walton nodded slowly, as if that answer settled something he'd been turning over for weeks. Bring the folder Thursday. Say exactly what you just told me. Nothing more, nothing less. Yes, sir. She left the way she'd come, quietly, past the front desk she'd manned every weekday for 22 years, and did not tell a single other person in the building what she was carrying. The hearing was set for Thursday at 10, in the executive conference room on 32. They met in the corridor outside at 9:55. Elena lifted her eyes to Dean's for 1 second and looked away. He held the door for her. Inside, the long table was already lined with directors. Desmond Cray sat at one end in a charcoal suit with the smallest, careful smile. The chair of the board read the charges aloud in a flat voice, the paper barely rustling as he turned it. Public humiliation of the chairman's personal consultant. Conduct unbecoming the chief executive role. A suggestion of personal entanglement compromising operational neutrality. Elena raised her hand for permission to speak. She accepted full responsibility for the lobby. She rejected, on the record, the second charge. The chair turned to Dean. There was a knock at the door. It opened before anyone answered. Loretta Byrne walked in her gray reception jacket, a thin folder under her arm, her back very straight. She didn't look at Cray. My apologies for interrupting. There's a matter the board needs before this goes any further. She set the folder on the table and stood behind it, hands folded, the way she'd stood at that front desk for 22 years, waiting for someone important enough to notice her. For the past 2 weeks, Mr. Cray has visited the contractor records archive after hours on 4 separate occasions, always alone, always logged as paperwork. On the third occasion I saw the light still on at 11 at night. Yesterday, at Mr. Sutter's request, the accounting office pulled a 2013 structural steel order approved by Mr. Cray, routed through a supplier that appears exactly once in 14 years of records. I have the sign-in log. I have the invoice. And I have an email, forwarded to this board this morning by that same accounting office, in which Mr. Cray requested the file be quietly archived before this week's audit. She paused. I've worked in the building Mr. Sutter designed for 22 years. I wasn't going to watch it get used to bury the truth about how it was paid for. Cray stood up. This is absurd. She's a receptionist. The door at the back of the room opened. Walton Prescott walked in. He didn't speak right away. He walked to the head of the table, stood behind the chairman's seat, and looked down the length of the table at Cray. Sit down, Desmond. Cray sat. I've had auditors quietly reviewing your contractor files for 6 weeks, Walton said, ever since a routine variance turned up in last quarter's numbers. I didn't have a name until this morning. Now I do. He turned to Elena. His face didn't soften. I appointed you because I believed you came from a place that wouldn't let you forget where you started. You forgot, for one morning. I trust the last 3 weeks reminded you why. I won't forget again, Elena said, steady. See that you don't. He looked at Dean. The corner of his mouth moved. My apologies. For the second time. Accepted. For the second time. The board chair cleared his throat and moved to strike the second charge from the record. Nobody objected. Cray didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. Nobody in that room yet knew how this would end for Cray. But everybody in it understood, in that second, exactly how it had begun, with 140 feet of hallway, and a lie that had been waiting 14 years to be walked. The board voted 8-1 to remove Desmond Cray from his position, effective immediately, and to refer the contractor file to outside counsel for a formal fraud review. He was escorted out through the front lobby by building security, in full view of the morning staff. Loretta watched him go from her post with no expression on her face. That evening Elena left the building at 7. She walked through the front lobby at the pace of someone no longer in a hurry, looking at the ceiling height, the proportion of the columns, the soft amber light Dean had specified for the evening hours. For the first time she understood he designed this room to forgive people for being tired. Loretta was still at the desk. Elena stopped in front of her. Thank you, Loretta. Loretta looked up, didn't smile, inclined her head the way she had 22 years ago to a young architect on his first walkthrough, and went back to her log. Dean was outside on the sidewalk, waiting on a ride that hadn't shown yet. He hadn't planned to walk out at the same time. He was simply there, hands in his pockets, looking up Front Street at nothing in particular, the collar of his flannel turned up against the evening cold. Can I drive you home? He looked at her. He nodded. She drove him across the bridge with the windows half down. The air off the river was cold and clean. The lights of downtown fell away behind them, one row of street lamps at a time. For a long time neither of them spoke. The radio stayed off. Sadie asked me something last night, Dean said. What did she ask? She asked if you were the lady from the bookstore card. Elena kept her eyes on the road. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know yet. I don't make my daughter promises I can't keep. Elena nodded slowly. The bridge unrolled ahead of them in 2 long curves of light. That's the right answer, she said. He didn't respond right away. Then, as she turned off toward Leland, you know why I didn't argue with you at the door that morning? Why? Because I designed that door. I knew exactly where it went. I trusted the building to speak for me. She glanced at him for the first time since she'd picked him up. The dashboard light caught the line of his jaw. And if it hadn't? He thought about it. Then I'd have walked out the back and gone home to my daughter, and that would have been fine too. I stopped expecting buildings to defend me a long time ago. That morning was a gift, Elena. I still don't know whose. He stepped out at his house and closed the door gently behind him. She watched him walk up the path. The porch light caught a small head in pajamas at the door, Sadie, waiting up. He bent and picked her up in one motion and carried her inside. The downstairs lamp went out. A smaller light went on upstairs. Elena sat at the curb almost 5 minutes before she pulled away. She drove back across the bridge with the windows still down and didn't turn the radio on once. 6 weeks later, on the first Saturday of December, the Riverwalk project broke ground with a small ceremony. The old brick warehouse had been opened into a soaring hall with tall windows facing the river. Cast iron columns ran in 2 long rows down the length of the space, repainted and left exposed. Dean had spent 6 weeks redesigning the circulation around them. He hadn't signed the drawings, only marked them in soft pencil and handed them back to the staff architect whose name would go on the title block. Elena stood at the entrance at 9:45. Walton was already inside, reviewing the program with staff. The white pickup pulled up at 5 of 10. Sadie got out first, sketchbook clutched to her chest, and ran straight at Elena, wrapping both arms around her legs. Elena crouched down. "Hi, Sadie girl." "Hi. Dad says this is the building you and him made." Dean came up behind his daughter, freshly shaved, looking at the brick facade the way a man looks at a face he hasn't seen in a long time. Elena stood, held out her hand. He looked at it. He hesitated 1 beat, not unkindly, then took it. Sadie took his other hand without being asked. The 3 of them walked through the front doors together. Walton spoke briefly under the skylight, acknowledged the donors, then acknowledged Dean by name, said the project wouldn't have happened without him, plainly, the way he said everything. The room applauded. Elena spoke last. 1 page of notes she never looked at. "I've learned something in the last 2 months," she said. "The way we greet someone at the door decides the way we run everything behind it. This building was built to welcome people in. I'd like to do the same." She didn't look at Dean. The room applauded. Afterward, Dean walked the length of the hall slowly, hands in his pockets, touching one of his own columns once with his palm before moving on. He stopped at the far window where the water came up close to the brick and stood there without speaking. Elena let him have it. Sadie followed him over after a while and stood beside him at the window. He bent down and pointed at one of the columns and told her something quiet. Sadie tugged her father's hand. "Dad. Can Elena come get coffee with us?" Dean looked over at her. She nodded, small. The coffee shop on Front Street smelled like butter and cinnamon. They took the table by the window, the small round one with the chipped marble top. Sadie opened her sketchbook. Dean ordered coffee for himself and Elena, cocoa for Sadie. They spoke quietly about the second phase of the project. Dean would consult again, same terms, 3 o'clock pickup, non-negotiable. The conversation was practical. Neither of them was practical about anything else in their lives at that moment, and they both knew it. "What are you drawing, Sadie?" Dean asked. She held up 1 finger. "Almost done." She finished her line, turned the sketchbook around, and slid it across the table to her father. Then she turned it toward Elena. A tower with its front doors drawn wide open. 3 figures walking through together, a man, a small girl, a woman with her hand in the girl's other hand. No back door on the page. Elena looked at it a long moment. She didn't say anything. Dean looked at it, then at his daughter, who was already turning to a fresh page to draw a cat and not paying attention to either of them. He spoke low, just for Elena. "You don't have to keep looking for the right door. You're already through it." Elena set her hand down on the table between the 2 cups, slowly, palm down, the way a person sets down something fragile. Dean laid his hand over hers. "Not all the way. Just at the knuckles, light, like a question." She didn't move her hand. Sadie gave her cat whiskers and a long curling tail and did not look up. Outside, Front Street moved on in its quiet Saturday way, and behind the window the 3 of them sat in the amber light of a building that had never once needed a back door to prove what it was worth. The door had never been the problem. It was only ever a matter of who got to choose which one opened.